And hey there, folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Interviews. I'm Arlyeon, and I'm here today with Tarn Adams.
Hey.
That was so amazingly enthusiastic. He's the developer of Dwarf Fortress, what is no doubt one of the most systematically complex games around at this point, indie or otherwise.
Oh yeah, that's correct. I mean, as far as I know, you never know what's lurking out there, but as far as I know, we're still in the top whatever percentile of complex games.
And continuing to make it more complex.
Yeah. We just allowed them to reflect on their past memories and change their personalities and intellectual values. So if you convict a chicken of a crime, they can become disillusioned with the law permanently, or they can regret having kids because they start to value their free time, and so forth. It's kind of, I mean, there are also positive changes. Yeah, no, I've always wanted to have character arcs in the game, and we're finally getting there.
God damn, now I really want to jump to the about the recent game thing, but we tend to start all of these off with stuff about the devs themselves, just sort of a bit about you. So, I guess to start with the gamer nerdy question, what would your favorite game be?
Oh well, I mean, it's always hard to do favorite questions, right? But if we take it in terms of the games that were the most influential coming up, then I mean, that would have to be games like Starflight and Ultima 4 and Ultima Underworld, those kind of older gnarly games that shaped like what my brother and I were. What we were interested in coming up. But I mean, in terms of what I play now, I just mostly play a bunch of console games and stuff because just, you know.
I was actually going to ask you, what have you been diving into recently?
Yeah, I mean, it's just need to relax, you know. So I mean, I played the Metal Dinosaurs game, and I played
Zero Dawn?
Yeah. And what else have I played recently? Geez, I mean, I played the two big games on the Switch, but I wasn't really into them that much.
Breath of the Wild
and Mario.
Okay.
I mean, Mario is just kind of like a short game itself, and then you're supposed to go on this 500 thing scavenger hunt or something, and I just like,
nah.
Just kind of tired of that. And then Breath of the Wild, I mean, I'm on the don't like damaging your weapons camp or whatever. I basically treated that game like a stealth game where you climb things and don't fight anything. It's just I just couldn't get into the whole like I need to be saving 4 weapons for a boss fight, and so I can't actually fight anything or whatever, and I don't know if I will have enough diamonds to repair the sword if it breaks or whatever. And it just, yeah, I didn't like thinking about that when I was playing. But I mean, it was fun climbing mountains and stuff. So yeah, that was all right. And I'm sure there have been a bunch of other things. I went back and was playing some of the Spiderweb software reissues for those like a Vernum role-playing game thing. He just put out the 3rd one. Yeah, you know, every 9 months or so you have to launch the rocket and Factorio, that kind of thing. So it's been all over the place, kind of.
Fair enough. So, again, we mentioned that, like, Dwarf Fortress is extremely complex. What actually got you into game development?
Oh, well, I mean, I was kind of raised into it. My father taught me BASIC when I was, like, 5 or 6. It's hard to remember, right? My first memories are writing code or watching video games, like these old kind of like Commodore 64 TRS-80 type BASIC games where the little critter dances around, or they're like interactive fiction games. I remember vaguely. Just it's always been there, and but not just the playing, but the writing of them, right? Like making a little thing move across the screen. Like the first things my brother and I did were like these weird sort of demo Like if the it's like the demo scene for ASCII moving around or whatever, it's like not incredibly interesting, but we made little people walk around and get killed by hazards, and we had a game where you raised a little pet rat and fed it food and so forth, and lots of weird arena games and explore the city games, and just lots of things like that. And then yeah, we eventually, because of the games we were playing, like I mentioned Starflight and Ultima, things like that, we wanted kind of these maps. We liked maps, making maps, and so we started kind of making this sort of procedural fantasy maps around the time I was like 13 years old. I picked up C, which made it a little more possible. It was harder in BASIC, at least with the compilers at the time, to sort of have enough memory and so forth, or at least we didn't know how to do it. But then I started making maps, right? Altitude and you know, whether or not they're forests and that kind of thing, dotting cities around and making ogres run around and, you know, break buildings and stack skulls in front of their caves and stuff. That was kind of like high school for me.
Fair enough. So I'm going to take it was something you sort of always wanted to do then.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's hard to even think about it as a motivation or a goal or a dream or anything like that. It's more like, you know, I enjoy, you know, say reading books or watching movies or whatever. I mean, making games is almost like media consumption for me in a way, or whatever. It's just this thing that happens during time that was free, and then it sort of became also a job or something now. I mean, it's like it's hard to distinguish or, you know, otherwise try and find its place in my life in that way.
So, in the end, what sort of skills has game development required you to use, and where did you develop them?
Oh, a lot of practice, really. I mean, it's like there's organization. You need to be able to organize your notes and things. I mean, they talk a lot about spreadsheets in kind of more traditional development context. I don't have any spreadsheets, which might surprise some people, but so it wasn't Excel or anything that was kind of the main skill I learned, but I did learn how to organize a lot of text notes and paper tablets and so forth. There's also the math skills happen to come in handy, and I learned that the formal way. That was kind of like my career before becoming a full-time game developer was being a mathematician, and so the necessary, or kind of, I mean, necessary is a strong word, but it really helps to linear algebra, for instance, right? When you're doing game development, when you have little matrices moving around, and, you know, the occasional differential equation if you're trying to, you know, model like an arrow in a windstorm and you want to know where it's going to hit and stuff, you can occasionally cheat, take shortcuts and so forth if you know enough math. And, you know, knowing probability, combinatoric stuff also comes in handy when you're setting up different chances. You just do things a little bit faster. And so I found that a lot of I'm able to develop quite a bit faster than I would be able to, because I have like just kind of the math is sitting in my my toolbox. And then, you know, things like music and art haven't been so big for us. Those would be, you know, handy, I suppose. Although we have kind of like chosen to make a text game just because it's faster to develop, and you don't have to kind of coordinate assets and that kind of thing. And we just have the one looping 4-minute soundtrack, which I guess, you know, some people leave on and some people turn off, which is, you know, perfectly fine. But that's as far as we ever got when it came to like audio or anything like that. So I didn't learn those things. And then there's the whole kind of programming side of it. You know, you develop skills in terms of like, people don't think of Dwarf Fortress as a particularly optimized game because of how slow it is, because there's a lot of complex systems moving about. But I have picked up quite a bit of skills in terms of, you know, getting things to move faster, architecture of programs and so forth. I never learned any of that formally. I just learned it all kind of on the job, so to speak. And I don't know how I rate there. I mean, I imagine I'm very good at it in terms of what you get out of just practicing and banging your head against the wall, but there are certain formalisms and large holes in my programming education that I'm sure would be helped by some kind of more formal education, or even a more formal sort of experience as being a AAA person or something like that. Like if I had a job for a while in the larger industry, I'm sure there'd be things I know that would help a lot. But I do have a lot of
like learning from peers.
Yeah, exactly, and learning not just from peers but from like institutional experience, right? That there are just certain ways to handle like how your version control system works, or how to best fill in a blob of territory a little more quickly than maybe I'm doing it, or something like that. There's lots of little tricks that come from having a society and mentorships and on the job training, that kind of thing. That I really don't know what my holes are, but the beast is trundling along, as it were, so I feel pretty good.
So, with those intro questions, we can now dive right into the nitty-gritty of Dwarf Fortress and what it is. And in that respect, how exactly did the idea for Dwarf Fortress come to be?
Yeah, there's kind of this two-track sort of evolution of it, because my brother and I have always been working on, by always in age 10 or whatever, working on some kind of fantasy game, right? We're like, we like the role-playing games and we like the books and that kind of thing. So we're like, okay, we're going to make this sort of random role-playing game. It was usually nothing to do really with like a community management or a fortress of people running around, getting drunk and causing trouble. It was more just like, here's a one character role-playing game. And we had that going. It started with a game called Drag Slay, which is kind of like the 8 characters you were restricted to back on the old operating systems for Dragon Slayer, because there were dragons that had special abilities that you would fight or whatever. But that kind of grew into just its own larger game, and then we started calling that Slaves to Armot, God of Blood, because we were being silly or whatever. And that was
tremendously edgy.
Yeah, like even the title screen bled, and you could cut it with the mouse and all that. That was all like 18 years ago or whatever, right? Just like there's a lot of bleeding title screens now, but we were pretty early into the whole like interactive title screen, cutting it with your mouse thing, right? Yeah, that's all like, yeah, it's just it's too stupid to be edgy or something like that. It's just milk toast, right? But it was this game where you generate this world and you could walk around. It had 3D models. The last iteration of it, they were terrible, but you could kind of define the animations for them and say like, oh, I want to walk on my hands or whatever, and it would come up with this really bad procedural animation for that. And you'd walk around like hunting rabbits with a bow, and I don't remember too much of else of what we did, but there wasn't anything to it, because we felt like we had to sort of build it from the bottom up. Define how curly the hair was on your arm before we made a town, right? Or something like that. It was just terrible because of some earlier problems we had with the code not being extensible enough, and we're like, oh, we need to start from the bottom up, because we were just kind of learning how to do architecture on programs on the fly, and it was just always a mess. And so we had this other side project starting up around the same time of that, like in the middle of that project, like 2002 or so, and Slaves to Armok ran from kind of 2000 to 2004 or 5. And so there was a side project we were working on, because we had put on, so we set up the web page in 2000 and kind of had these side projects going, like World War I Medic and Liberal Crime Squad are kind of the two that maybe anybody has played. And so we were going to start a new one called Mutant Miner. And it was just going to be like, hey, you go around in this cliff face and you mine up these sort of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle mutagen canisters to grow more arms so that you can mine faster, right? Or whatever. That's kind of the core game loop. And then we were like, oh, we need more miners or whatever. It'd be cool to have kind of a system where you had a bunch of miners. But we didn't have a good turn-based system for that. You just kept flipping between the miners. It was like the worst sort of interface you can imagine for just like, now I'm controlling this one, now I'm controlling this one or whatever. And we were like, okay, so the game needs to be real-time. And then you have a bunch of real-time miners walking around, mining in this cliff face. And as we were thinking about, what kind of homes we wanted them to have and so forth, my brother and I were just like, eventually got into this thing just in this sort of 3-day feverish phone call where we're like, okay, this is actually going to be this real-time sort of dwarf arcade game. There's going to be these miners mining into the cliff face, and then after your fortress, you know, once you're into dwarves, you get into the whole digging too deep thing, and you eventually lose the game, right? And we're like, then you'll bring in this adventure in this little mini roguelike where you go and explore this fortress that you had dug out, and you kind of collect points for like finding journals that the dwarves had made and bringing out their best artifacts. And so the dwarf mode was to set the maximum score, and then the adventure mode that you'd go in and play would say like how many of those points that you actually got, and then they would put you in a score list. It was going to be a 2-month project, and we were just going to release it and then go back to Armok or whatever, right? And it didn't work out that way. The Dwarf Fortress was like a giant black hole, right? Just sucking all of the features from Armok into itself because it was so fast to add features to the text game. We weren't like worrying about 3D models or modeling a 3D landscape anymore. And it just kind of got sort of, addictive is not the word I'm looking for, but it was enthralling. Yeah, engrossing. To kind of get caught up in that, right? To be able to add and see and make the game better and better and better. And we worked on that for 4 years on and off and released the first version in 2006.
Okay, so you mentioned this already a little bit with the digging too deep alongside the dwarves, but have there been any games or literature which helped you develop Dwarf Fortress?
Yeah, so I mean the different inspirations. I mean, obviously there's the whole sort of Tolkien, Lord of the Rings / sort of Silmarillion branch of literature, and sort of the I guess things like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms plays into it. Just these large like multi-character, many character, 100-character stories that we were kind of interested in. And that was really like the principal motivation came from that. And then there are just other nods to various pieces of our life. Like there's things taken from the writings of the Assyrian kings and some of the things, because my brother studied that stuff in college. And we have other bits and pieces. Obviously there's a lot of roguelike inspirations in there, and we use a lot of their symbols, like the ampersand for demons and the @ sign for the adventurer. All comes from that tradition, and then we just heavily borrow from those traditions. And then there's just a lot of things about our interests. Like we have some hundreds of real world animals in the game, and that just came from interest in zoology. And same thing with all the gemstones and geology in the game. Just happened to be a side interest that kind of worked its way in. It was kind of like the one of the kind of key principles, I guess, behind the development of Dwarf Fortress is that there's really no limitation to the kind of inspirations you're allowed to bring into game development, and that it doesn't just have to be other games or traditional media, but really entire branches of inquiry can be modeled and systematized and placed into a video game.
Is there any other bits of, I guess, learning that you're intending on incorporating into the game?
Yeah, I mean, there's any manner of things. I mean, the it's going to be interesting. The next 2 big pushes, for instance, there's the sort of myth and magic release. And we're just going to be kind of, I suppose, cannibalizing a lot of real-world religious systems, and also fantasy world building that other people have done to kind of say, like, what are the sort of irreducible components that make up these things, and then how can we put them in a jar and shake them together and build connections to create kind of generate magic systems and generate creation myths and so forth. And there's a lot of learning that goes on in that process. I mean, people kind of make fun of us and say that our design document is Wikipedia or something, but it's not too far off how the process works. And then after that, there's a kind of an interesting, like we're thinking of doing sort of modeling customs and law and property and different sort of government systems and so forth. And there's a lot we don't know about that, right? And a lot of deeper questions about how people relate to their customs and what it means to owe something, and what it means for a person to have power over another person, right? Like, where does the power derive from, and who exercises it? What are the limits on it? That are going to have to be systematized and kind of understood even by the characters in the game to some extent. And we haven't done, the heavy reading on that, and there's going to be, quite a bit of ongoing learning. Seems to be the theme.
I feel like this is going to lead down a rabbit hole of a lot of Kafka.
Yeah. I mean, yes. What is it? An enormous. Quite what he wakes up as, but it's
an enormous cockroach. Yeah. That'll probably happen in the myth release before we even get to the bureaucracy.
But yeah, it's a fascinating ride anyway.
There's also in alchemy is a thing, I do believe, at least in fledgling states. Is there going to be, for what it is it going to be pulling more from the real world roots, the sort of mythological roots, or a combination of the two?
So I imagine what's going to happen there, we have kind of a thing, previous alchemy that we didn't do anything with, and then we just turned it into a soap making shop. And then you basically get tallow and use lye and make soaps. But alchemy is of course a big thing, in the first myth release is going to include some things along those lines. And what we generally do is if we try to take real world mythological systems and religions and things like that, it's like Christ and Buddha are not making their appearance in the game. That's just not going to happen unless someone wants to mod them in or whatever. But but also things like we avoided calling things a Brazil nut in the game and called it a paradise nut instead. And we just generally, it's not always possible, but we try and kind of avoid real world names and symbols. So having alchemy that came as a kind of the sort of a cult or whatever, right? Those sort of things just wouldn't go into the game in that form. You wouldn't have whatever, I don't know much about it, but you wouldn't be assigning them to the same sort of astrological symbols or whatever, because those stars wouldn't exist, right? But at the same time, all of the actual chemistry in terms of this is how you make, sulfuric acid or whatever, as long as it falls within our year 1400 cutoff, is kind of how we work with technologies. And that's all, to us, that kind of thing is valid. And when we do things with lye, for instance, I mean, we're working with and quicklime and things like that. We're working within a system of we're trying not to be too technical about it. So instead of calling it nitric acid, it would be called spirit of niter or whatever, right? And sulfuric acid is called oil of vitriol, I think, something like that.
Yeah, oil of vitriol is its old school name.
Yeah, so those things would go in, as well as whatever appropriate production methods there are, and we would just try and sort of systematize, okay, these are these are acids, these are bases, you'll get salts from these and so forth, to whatever extent. But then with the myth and the magic system generator, there would be alchemies built procedurally, right, on top of the world, so that if in a certain world the jade is associated to a god of rivers that had a terrible run-in with a bear or something like that, right? Then maybe jade would have kind of an effect on bears or something, right? There'd be this sort of conceptual linkage that it can come up with in the stories that it creates just by bouncing the bits and bobs around, making a little story. Then the conceptual links of the different verbs and nouns in that story can be used to form alchemical properties, and not just alchemy, but just magic systems in general, right? It's like if the dwarves in one universe were forged on an anvil, then they might have certain sort of inherent powers, whereas if they were smoothed as stones in a river in a different story, then your dwarves might even have more of a watery aspect to them in their procedural magic system. And it's all pretty simple in the sense that, you know, this is water, this is this, or whatever. But as a world building exercise, it does about, you know, as well as a bad author, which is all we can hope for, right? We're just kind of trying to replicate, you know, cheap, crappy fantasy writing, and, you know, let the professionals do their thing.
This sounds like with more and more things that can all have their own unique permutations, just the interactions are going to lead to, eventually someone is going to make like pies that explicitly attract bears to the pie and then enrage them.
Yeah, exactly. It's there's gonna be a kind of like we never intentionally lean into the zaniness. Like Dwarf Fortress is sometimes seen as a zany game, but we try our best not to make it zany, because the zaniness is going to happen on its own, right? It's like
on that note,
yeah.
On that note, do you have a favorite Dwarf Fortress story?
Oh no! I mean, it's so hard. There's so many. We don't like picking favorites.
One.
I mean, I mean, the problem is when people ask me about the favorite stories, I always come back to the same damn stories, right? And they're always bugs, you know. Like my early favorite is the Hammerer bug, which I don't remember if you've bumped into that or not, but where the Hammerer, who's the executioner in the fortress, was injured and unable to pick up his hammer to hammer one of the prisoners. But he still did an attack, and so he started biting the prisoner because his arms were injured, and he just felt that he had to perform his duties, and so he bit the guy's arm off and then carried it around in his mouth for years. And that was the bug report, is like, my executioner has someone's arm in his mouth. That was amusing. But then we got to the whole cat thing with the cats all dying in the bar. Yeah. I mean, those I mean, all my favorite stories are all like these bug reports, right? When it comes to like people's sort of, you know, heroic and interesting stories and all the stories of playthroughs on the forums and stuff, I don't remember them as well. Because they're not. I mean, they're all sort of run together at some point. But yeah. So yes, my apologies for not having a concise answer.
No worries at all. So, what do you feel is the most important part of Dwarf Fortress's identity?
Yeah. I mean, identity as a kind of game or tool is just the ability to create complex narratives, or have basically an assistant for a player to create and then share those narratives with other people. I think is the sort of the core defining feature. But I mean, a lot of games have that property to different degrees and in different directions. So, I mean, the you know, some of the things that were earlier identifying features are just, you know, dwarves acting irrationally and being killed by elephants and carp, right? was a you know, quite an important defining feature. But I think that's kind of become less true now, and people just think of it more as sort of a storytelling aid, or a almost like a lot of the people that interact with the game now just read stories online, and don't play the game at all. And, you know, we consider that part of our community, right? That's part of, and those are including the people that support us online. You know, a lot of them don't play the game. It's just part of the experience of being, you know, a part of the community, is to see the kind of strange things that have happened without, you know, necessarily having to put in the time with what is a very sort of, you know, non-intuitive, clunky, and time-consuming interface to kind of squeeze the jelly out of the game that is, you know, a story, which is like the worst metaphor I've come up with in a long time. But it's like there's kind of different tiers. I don't want to rank them or anything, but different groups of community members and people that play more casually, but and then people that build computers inside of the game, right? Like there's a functioning calculator that has however many digits. It can multiply 2-3-digit numbers together and has a one of those 7-segment displays run with drawbridges, so you can actually see the numbers. But the computer runs with, I don't know how many parts, 80,000 parts or whatever. They built it up over a long period of time. Yeah, no, they're amazing. And they made a run Space Invaders that a dwarf can play with levers. You order your dwarf which levers to pull, and it plays Space Invaders in real time. And I don't know how those computers were operated, because you can operate a computer by running water through floodgates and pressure plates and stuff to do the logic. And I guess there were real water computers in the past, right? And they also have animal-powered computers that run on pressure plates. And then there's also vampire-powered computers that you can run by having vampire dwarves pull levers, and you just lock them inside the machine because they don't need to eat, and they just get, I guess, grumpy when they haven't had blood to drink, but, that's their problem. But they'll still follow orders, and so you can set them on either patrol patterns to walk on pressure plates, or you can tell them to pull a lever or something like that. It's an amazing world people have created out there, and we had no expectation that would happen, right? I mean, my brother and I neither of us are really computer minded, right? It's like I've been programming as a practical measure to get the game built, but I don't know anything about like assembly language or logic gates or anything like that. But that doesn't mean other people don't know. And as long as the system is, Turing complete or whatever, they can do whatever they want and do.
On that note, actually, so what was the biggest challenge in actually developing the engine for Dwarf Fortress?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just getting Windows to work or whatever at first, right? I mean, those message loops and all that kind of thing. And I actually had a big problem with one of my old games, like developing an error over time because I wasn't operating the message pump properly, because I had kind of half learned it from books and demos and, didn't really know what the pitfalls were. And, other than that, I mean, we've just been building it up slowly over time. I mean, I think it's fair to say the twin challenges that are kind of, have caused trouble for Dwarf Fortress are the interface programming and the speed of the game. Like, as you make the game more complex, you have to optimize more and make decisions about how much stuff you want to put in the game. And we always kind of err in the sense of error being an error. We always err on the side of making the game a little more complex than it probably, could be, in terms of, speed being, staying up at this many frames per second or whatever has been, a struggle. But in terms of like the conceptual side of things, there's not a whole lot of problems, because we kind of, if you plan things out ahead of time, you just know what's going to be super impossible, right? It's like time travel. There are some kind of cool time travel games that have a limited scope, right? Like you can rewind your platformer, or there was that neat RTS that had like the different time waves or whatever. I can never remember the name of it because it begins with A, I think, and it's like some sci-fi word, right? So how am I supposed to remember? Arlyeon, if you look up time travel RTS, you'll find it. And it had this cool kind of time wave mechanic. So you had to fight in different times. And I don't even remember how you win the game or whatever. But so for us, time travel, there's just too much data to really do it reliably. We could do a few little gimmicky things, but it wouldn't feel right. And so we just kind of, didn't do that. And there, I imagine we'll run into other trouble along those lines. Like, if you want to make like a mirror plane that's like a shadow world that is alongside the other world, but it has significant differences in terrain or geography, then you just double the memory and you're in a lot of trouble, right? But we can do things like a shadow plane that has the same terrain, because then you don't run into a memory problem. So there's a whole lot of technical constraints that drive what is added to the game, and you kind of run into those as you go along.
So, what has been the most interesting emergent properties of Dwarf Fortress you've encountered while developing the game?
Huh. Yeah, no, that's a that's a very difficult question. So as you can probably tell over the course of the interview, I don't categorize things by top. It's difficult for me to come up with favorites. So it's like I'm just trying to think about like what was something recently interesting that's happened in terms of that, and it's a lot of this kind of contaminants and poisons on the ground has been very interesting, because it's not just the cats that walked through the booze and cleaned themselves and got sick, right? There's a ongoing interesting problems of like these big beasts that come from underground. The forgotten beasts often have like dust that they scatter or slime that they leave on the ground that the dwarves then track on their feet. And if you haven't been giving your shoes to your dwarves properly, then you might notice that their feet are getting blisters, or that their feet are rotting off entirely because they've been walking through this kind of sludge that you can't really control or whatever. And so there's this sort of spatial component to the control, right? That you want to be able to shut off entire areas and so forth, and that gets way too fiddly. And so you have to kind of worry about that. And then we haven't quite gotten into like more conceptual pollution yet, although we are starting that now. Like you could read a book now that changes your mind about your values. So you could think, for instance, that war and peace, you might side more with like, well, war is a great thing or whatever, or peace is more preferable. It's very simple right now, right? They don't think too much about self-defense or just cause or any of the middle ground, but they just kind of think good, bad on a sliding scale. And whatever that sliding scale means. But it's the sort of thing that can actually change a world. Like if you went around in adventure mode as an adventurer, leaving books of peace out for people to read, and they somehow read them, which is the hard part, to get them to read, which is why you more have to like argue it, because you can do that in conversations. And you can actually change the world. If you convinced every demon emperor of the goblins that peace was a good thing, they would actually stop fighting people. And it's too easy to convince them right now, especially when they're demons and maybe should be more hardwired for that sort of thinking, rather than just having any adventure be able to walk by and like, hey, you should stop killing people. And they're like, oh, you're right. I mean,
it's pretty cool if there's occasionally one who'd be like, yeah, sure, that's fine.
yeah, no, it's and we interesting. The whole thing where all of your biases and all that are kind of baked into your systems, right? So for us, it's like when we have a procedural demon generator and we needed to decide, which personality facets of demons are immutable and which ones are sliding, right? So we have, and I'm vaguely trying to remember this, but I wouldn't quote myself on any of it, which is like gluttony, for instance, is one of the or intemperance, I think we call it, or whatever, is one of the sliders for personalities, and it goes from like 0 to 100 or whatever. And so we decided that demons should probably be able to slide on that scale. That's like, not all demons want to go out and like drink and eat a bunch of cake or whatever, but some of them, that's like their defining characteristic, right? Is
which makes
their
sense, because demons, 7 deadly sins, yada.
Yeah, and which is, I mean, because part of our personality system derived from actually Thomas and stuff, because the sort of ocean, like 30-facet psychological models and stuff are not nearly judgmental enough to make a narrative fiction, right? So we threw in some more traditional shots at people criticizing and judging them, and for instance, so yeah, the intemperate demon. But then when we were thinking about what about empathy, and I believe, I mean, this is just an example, correct or not, but that would be one that, for instance, we just set to 0. It's like, no, the demons aren't sitting there thinking about your feelings, well, at the same time, maybe you're like, well, maybe they're highly swayed by emotional appeals and so forth, but should they be cruel? Should they be merciful? should a demon be able to be impartial but not cruel when it's doing things, right? So there's just a whole lot of world building that's kind of implicit in these little flips of the coin that go on in the random generator that have reverberate through your entire game and define how people think of the game and how people think of demons and think of goblin society and think of all of everything when you allow those decisions to have an impact on the game and define more and more impacts as you like code up little mechanisms here and there. And just kind of go through on a case by case basis, and good enough is good enough, right? There was a lot of imperfect mechanics in the game because you just get tired of staring at a list. Like when I just added those long-term memories being able to change into values and personality changes, there are something like 240 possible memory types, and then I'd have to go through the 130 or whatever emotion and 30 or whatever value systems and say like which possible combinations of these work with all these things, and that's something like 40,000 combinations or whatever at the barest minimum to check. And I'm like, I'm not going to check that. So it's like it's the sort of thing where you're like, but you don't want to sort of crowdsource something so important either, or maybe you do and you just have to check the work or whatever, right, to make sure that like it's not getting too loose or too restrictive on what sort of personality changes there can be. It's like I have people like they have a memory of when they didn't have clothes and they felt mortified because the player just didn't provide them with clothes and their clothes rotted off their bodies or whatever. It's supposed to be a bad memory that causes stress in the fortress, but we didn't want it to cause stress forever. So after a couple years, they can look back on that memory and they can feel right now, just because I have limited time, they can feel one of two things. They can feel, they can change that mortification into amusement, and then they can become possibly more shameless, they can become more zany, and they can also care about decorum less, right, as an intellectual value. That's one transition that can cause, like, that's like it's not the most dramatic character arc, but it's a character arc, right? That's something that can happen to them. But on the other hand, they could turn that mortification into just a general feeling of disquiet or uneasiness that's not as stressful. It's like if you think back on embarrassing moments in your life, they're not all like, it's not all like you're just laughing them off. Sometimes you just like have a tick of your head and you're like, ah, or whatever, right? It's just like, that was something that happened 15 years ago that was bad. And, that could change your personality a little bit in another way, right? It's like, maybe I'll be a little more cautious now. That dwarf becomes a little more cautious, or that dwarf becomes a little disillusioned with society that let that happen to them or whatever. Or maybe that dwarf becomes more empathetic, right? They won't laugh at somebody now that they see who's naked or whatever, right? It's like there's little things that we just, I put in as many as I could do in the time I set aside for it and called it good enough and moved on to the next thing.
So, in regards to features, are there any that you'd like to implement but which have so far been problematic to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned time travel, right? That's kind of the big one that's sitting there. Other ones are mix, right? Like the thing that like imagine all those falling sand type games, right? The oil floats on the water, the sand sinks through the water and lies on the bottom, right? And we'd love to have more fluids. Right now, the only fluids we have in the game there's the liquid ones, there's water and magma, and then there's all the gases, and gases are pretty easy to deal with. And gases right now in the game can be any type of material, but the fluids, the liquid fluids, can only be water and magma. We'd like to have sand that acts more like a liquid. We'd like to have oil that can float on top of the water. We'd like to do like scary places where there's like lakes of blood and that kind of thing. Right now it can rain blood in scary places, and the blood can kind of pool on the ground, but it can never get so deep that it actually flows. It can like stick to the bottom of your shoes, but you can't drown in it or anything, and it can't like flow down a corridor. And there's just a lot of problems with mixing fluids, which fluids are mixable or miscible or whatever fluids. and which fluids float on other fluids. It just starts to get to be a nightmare of CPU and memory and stuff like that, right? And but unlike time travel, we're still vaguely optimistic that we can pick something up there, like make some ground there, even if it's not perfect. And similarly, we have things like lighting. We haven't just haven't gotten into lighting at all in the game. Like, it's a big question, right? Should dwarves be able to see in the dark, or should they have like a bunch of gem lights or some weird magical thing, or should they be
lights.
Yeah, yeah, or should they be walking around with candles, right, or something like that, right? And you know, and there are humans in the game, and humans, you know, probably just walk around with candles, but right now they don't have to, or it actually does get dark and they would like to, but they don't have those choices available. But it's difficult, right? I mean, even in a text graphics game, saying like how much light is there from these X amount of light sources and stuff can just get to be a pain when people are running around. It's just, I mean, it's funny when people talk about like, oh, you know, movable light sources. We have graphics cards to deal with that. Blah blah blah. We can have X number of movable light sources and this ambient light and this scattering light and all these other tricks and stuff. Whereas with me, I just have to figure out how it works on a grid. But it's still, you know, is it too much, right? It's like the weather system we put in ended up being too much for what we got out of it, because we've got, you know, hot and cold air masses bumping into each other. They can make warm fronts and cold fronts, and it'll make cirrus clouds properly form 24 hours before a warm front rolls in and all that kind of stuff. But it's like in the game, in fort mode especially, where you can't even look at the sky, it's just like, it is raining. It is now clear out. Oh, now it's raining again or whatever, but it's actually, the rain is coming from this complicated system. But it's just not, it just wasn't worth it.
Sort of awesome. Although also, by the way, if you made like fungal light, I'd probably feel compelled to like grow it on the dwarf's clothes somehow.
Well, I mean, yeah, you should be playing Caves of Cud is what you should be doing. You've got fungal infections that grow on your body, and they've been working on that game for 10 years. It's like the Gamma World cousin of Dwarf Fortress.
Huh.
Yeah, that game's cool. Very complex.
So, what is one of the unintended, I'd say consequence, but it's less for a bug and more of unintended features that have cropped up as you've updated the game?
Yeah, I'm sure this question has an answer. There are things that we have adopted that players have done, that we've then run with, but it's very difficult to call any to mind. I'm helping your editor out a lot. This is going to be a big dead space. What is a thing?
The thing is a thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what thing where, I mean, and if you don't count like water computers or whatever. Ah, geez, what else happened? I
mean, particle smashers?
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's like if you being able to stack like as many items as you want in a square was like a known problem we had, right? I mean, it's something we'd like to fix, but it's hard to fix, right? It's like we'd like to add some. I mean, essentially, you need to have like the pile of items eventually turn into a whole tile, just called like a mass of crap or whatever. And you could make piles of dragon hordes that way that actually form multiple Z levels or something like that. You could slide down a mountain of skulls or something like that. But without that, then you just stack everything in the same square, and then yeah, I mean it's like it's you know, so then players would exploit that. And I'm not sure if that's an intended feature, though, because we'd like to get rid of all of the uses of vampires. I think we didn't think of a lot of that in advance, especially when they started, like like in this game, the way it works right now is you can become a vampire if you drink another vampire's blood. And so what players actually did was to take the blood from a vampire and somehow get it in their well, so that all of the dwarves that drank out of that well would become vampires. And then you can segregate the society based on vampires and non-vampires, and someone set up a exterior fortress that had just vampires in it for defensive purposes, and then the interior fortress, which was non-vampires. So the exterior fortress couldn't feed on their interior, but was still set to guard and so forth.
And drain and murder everything that showed up.
Yeah, and because vampire soldiers are much stronger and more agile than regular dwarves, and they don't need to sleep or eat or drink. I mean, they like to drink.
Can't you
they like
also
to drink blood.
Make them undead? Like you can be like a necromancer vampire.
Yeah. I don't know if you can be a necromancer or vampire.
I think you can be both.
Can you do that?
You have to do it in a certain order, though.
That would make
I think
sense.
You have to be a vampire first and then get the necromancer tome, and it's just easier because you're already undead. So all the undead on the way to like the necromancer tome are like.
Oh, that's right. They don't care. The zombies just look at you.
And then
and I think
necromancers don't have stat atrophy.
Yeah, so I think what you're probably better at listing anesthetic. None of that was really stuff we thought of. And in fact, the way that I think the vampire and the werewolf curse interact was something that we only put in afterward in terms of one not being able to turn into the other, if we even did that. I can't even remember anymore, right? There's just too much data for me to remember. Sometimes what all is going on there. And there were other cool things, like with the way that the sewer systems emptied into the river. Like, we weren't expecting hippos to be going into the sewers and creating urban legends down there or whatever, but they do that. It was very weird to see the hippos in the sewers. Imagine any number of other things, like the when we taught people how to climb, and the siegers suddenly were able to hop over walls and stuff, and we had thought of that, but just seeing them always find the little vulnerability in your fortress that the player didn't spot, and then a player maybe at first thinking that the people had cheated, and then they discover, no, there's actually this little way into my fortress now, or whatever. All that's really cool.
So, with all this said, and with, you mentioned the next updates were the sort of myth and magic one and the politics one, will development ever end, or do you have more planned beyond that?
Oh, we got plenty. Yeah, no, we've got plenty to do beyond that, because once the property law, customs, whatever release is done, then we have different directions we can go, right? We really want to do boats, right? Because boats are cool, multi-tile boats that you can sail around and stuff, and also that can arrive to if you put your fortress in a sea cave, and then boats could sail in and trade with you in some giant grotto place underground or whatever, and then
Pirate
sail
cave.
out. Yeah, it'd be really cool. And then but also that leads to one of the reasons we were thinking of doing boats first is because so much of a regular economy is based on water transport, right? Whether that's rivers or oceans, and we just kind of wanted to have it in place first. But generally, we need to do economy stuff, right? There's not any trading except at your fortress after world generation, whereas world generation has this whole giant industry and trading system set up. It's why when you go to a market in adventure mode, they can say this is, I don't know, orca leather from faraway coastal city with a given name, and it's it is actually from there, and it was actually produced in world generation and then actually traded to that society, but then that stops after world generation because we haven't gotten to the economy stuff yet. because the economy was kind of broken down. We had it many years ago in fort mode. They could set up little shops and pay rent and be evicted from their apartments and stuff, but it just didn't work well. And I think the modders still turn it on sometimes because it's all still compiled into the game. So there's that branch, and then there's the whole kind of crime and punishment branch of the game, like having having your adventurer properly prosecuted, thrown in jail, and thrown in the gibbet cage and pecked at and stuff. All kinds of different aspects there, and then there's the army stuff, which we're doing a bit now before the magic to kind of tide people over, but this whole kind of villains and armies and that sort of we're going to do that for another like 4 or 5 months, just working on that stuff before we disappear into Mythland for a couple of years, so there's a lot, and it's kind of an ongoing list of features. There's a whole, like, we just barely got started on the whole espionage thing. Right now there are agents that can have secret identities that collect information about artifacts in the different towns, but they don't collect any other information. There's no like assassins or anything, and other missing bits. And as you add more stuff to the game, it increases the amount of stuff that you can add. It doesn't decrease it, right? It's like blowing up a balloon. The surface area of the balloon increases. You can there's more avenues, right, to go down the more stuff you add to the game. So there's really no end in sight. We're not planning on ending, and we don't really have a solid retirement plan anyway. So we just treat it like we're, musicians or whatever, just like I don't know, the Rolling Stones or the blues guys that just kind of go on until they're 80, 90 years.
When you said the blues guys, all I could think of was the Blues Brothers.
Yeah, I like B.B. King and yeah. Well, yeah, the Blues Brothers kind of went on too, didn't they? They added movies beyond the original many years later. I don't know what they're doing now. I think they're both still alive, right? No, only one of them's alive.
Yeah,
but then they had the 2001. No, but they replaced him with like John Goodman or something, right, in 2000 or something.
Yeah.
God, I don't know. And so that's who knows? This is a very complicated life, but so for us, it's like we have no plan to stop. I mean, I'm sure in our addlement we will be forced to stop at some point, and then God knows what'll happen. Just probably get thrown in the ditch like every other American.
Wow, dark. So, I know you're not one for playing favorites, but do you have like a really notable memory of watching someone play your game? And as a sort of follow-up to that, whenever you're done with this one, is there any specific homages to your work that you follow?
So, yeah, the like actually watching someone play the game is not something we've really done. We haven't watched a lot of channels. I'm aside from play tested or something, the only real memory I have of that at all is like we were with one of our friends and we were just like going through Twitch for whatever, and our friend typed in Dwarf Fortress into Twitch, and we're like, because we don't really watch people play our game, but we just saw this guy building his fortress, and we were in kind of a mood. We noticed that he was digging out his well, and we noticed that his well, or his channel that he was making a moat or something like that, I don't quite remember, was really close to his whole underground area, and that he wasn't really noticing that it was going to intersect very badly and flood his entire fortress. So we had kind of the choice in the chat, where there weren't that many people. I think it might have just been us, but we weren't logged in by name or anything. We were just anonymous in there, and we could type in a warning, or we could encourage him to dig. And naturally, we encouraged him to dig, and he flooded his fortress. We were like, we felt kind of bad about it, because we were like, is he going to start, feeling sad or whatever, right? And So what he did was he reached off screen and he pulled back this giant bong and took a hit, and just mellowed out, and everything was okay. And that was like that was my experience with watching people play my game. As for homages, I mean, there are a lot of, I mean, that's like, I mean, Boat Murdered is a very funny traditional tale from, 11 years ago now. And then there's the whole, I don't know how to pronounce my own language, but the whole Matol Remrit Brave Mule one, that Kevin Snow and I don't remember who else. I don't know if Priscilla was involved with that or a list of other people, but they made this really, really cool one that was like, it had a very strong voice, and they had pictures and also videos associated with that.
The ones with custom art are so neat.
Yeah, and then they've gone on to become game developers now. I mean, they contributed to Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. They have their Mama Possum game and their Southern Monsters game. They have a lot of cool stuff going on, and they're just running off doing video games now. And I met them at GDC a couple months ago, and for the first time. And then there's all of just the fan art, just as not even as like playthrough artifacts, but just like the fan art is great, because especially when it's like of the forgotten beasts, the random creatures, because it kind of reminds us when my brother and I were playing Starflight. Like, if you played the Starflight's a game from like 1986, right? And you just fly between like 800 procedural planets and collect life forms and stuff. You haven't played it? Yeah. Well, don't play it on the Sega, because the Sega, if I remember, does not have procedurally generated creatures, but the PC version has procedurally generated creatures, which is like one of the biggest inspirations for Dwarf Fortress, and it's the reason that we have those forgotten beasts at all. Is because it just has they just have this little paragraph, like we generate a little paragraph description of our critters as well. And that's like, if you do a Google image search for like Dwarf Fortress Forgotten Beast, you'll see all kinds of drawings, all different art styles and stuff. And it's great, because when Zach, my brother, and I were kids, we would draw our Starflight creatures. We had like a little captain's log, like these little tablets. And I was like 8 years old at the time. We had this captain's log, and drawing, like we'd see a life form, and we'd dutifully draw the life form and write its characteristics and what coordinates it was found at on which planet. We'd just fill up notebooks with these drawings of little animals. So it was great to see other people doing that, because it's like, it feels like that's the main true way that we've kind of paid it forward, or whatever, is by having people draw random creatures.
That's actually really heartwarming and really neat. So, sort of winding down now, I was curious what your thoughts are on games that are sort of akin, like, albeit a bit more accessible at the cost of perhaps depth. Things like RimWorld or Nomeria.
Yeah, it's all cool, right? Because and the people that made those games, have all kind of mentioned Dwarf Fortress. So, I mean, in a kind of cynical sense, it's all advertising, right? But it's in a kind of joyous sense, those are all games that people play, and it's like I don't know what the sort of genealogies are. There's Infiniminer led to Minecraft with like a touch of Dwarf Fortress, and maybe Minecraft had something to do with Terraria. I have no idea, or where Terraria came from, right? But Terraria led to a whole bunch of other games and is still leading to games. And then there's the whole sort of RimWorld, Nomeria branch of it, and then like Prison Architect is a kind of Dwarf Fortress inspired game, if I recollect explicitly. And there's this whole kind of just branch of games, and I've met quite a few independent developers now that are kind of doing interesting games that have Dwarf Fortress roots. I mean, there's like Stonehearth, and I think is it now called King Under the Mountain? I don't remember. There's all kinds of interesting sort of takes on the dwarf fortress. It's not a genre, and we didn't start it or anything. I mean, there are tons of colony builders before Dwarf Fortress, but it certainly did spark a lot of people's interest. And so, I don't know, it's just part of the ecosystem. Every game stands on its own as a game that people like or not, right? So yeah, no, we think it's all cool. I mean, Dwarf Fortress is a very inaccessible game, and if people can get a similar experience with a game that they can actually play, that's better than not, right?
So, is there anything that you'd like to share with the audience, or words you may have for aspiring devs?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, if you're aspiring, then make sure to practice. Practice is incredibly important. Don't overplan. Don't underplan, but you'll figure out what that means later. It's important just to crash against every now and again, I think, if you have free time for it. But it is, it is difficult to find the time, and don't sell your house or anything. And you can practice when you have a day job. I did that for quite a bit, although my job was not strenuous. I understand other people have much more strenuous jobs than I had when I was working. So, but as long as you stick to it even a little bit, you'll get better at it. That doesn't mean that you'll succeed. It just means that you'll get better at it. You'll make better games, and you'll, at least have something you can enjoy for yourself. But also, I mean, other people have different thoughts about this. I'd say people should have a public presence as soon as they can. You're only gonna, especially with things like Patreon, right? I mean, people just kind of show up, and one at some point you're making $50 a day, and then not a day. That'd be nice. You're $50 a month, and then it turns into $75 a month. People tend to stick around, especially if you're working and publicly kind of sharing your stuff. So keep working, keep sharing your stuff, and there's different ways to get paid for it. I don't have a lot of practice with working on a game in secret and then kind of setting up a launch and then making the launch work. So it's like, if that's your model, I wouldn't take advice from me on that. There's reasons people have to be secretive about things, because people get scooped all the time. It just happened with Baba Is You, right? That whole kind of scam or whatever. I don't know what it was going on there, but someone copied the assets and created a copy of it, or it happened with ridiculous phishing or whatever, right? You have to be careful, depending on the type of game that you have and whether or not it's clonable and all that kind of thing. But yeah. So that's my rambling take. You can get much more concise and better one, online. There's a lot of great Twitter threads and other things that if you follow people that are working.
And I suppose lastly is, are there any specific indie projects that you'd like to sort of highlight for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. I mean, I mentioned Caves of Cud. That's like, if you have played Dwarf Fortress and not played Caves of Cud, you should really check it out. If you like role-playing games, because it's not a colony manager, right? It's a role-playing game, but it's very complex and interesting, and the stories that you get out of it are Dwarf Fortress stories, and the way that there's all these moving bits, and they have procedural villages and procedural quests and procedural histories, all the kinds of things that you like. So I definitely put that on the top of my my kind of, for Dwarf Fortress people, my kind of recommended list for that. I haven't been following too closely what else has kind of been going on, so I'll just leave it there.
Okay, and in that case, for you folks in the audience, if you'd like to go and give a peek at Dwarf Fortress, you can go to www.bay12games.com/dwarves. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to direct people?
Yeah, well, if you do like the game, we always appreciate people that pop into our Patreon or click the little PayPal button or whatever. the game is run like 100% on contributions from people. You know, aside from the kind of token amount I make from my book editing. That's Tanya Short from Kit Fox Games, who's now working on Boyfriend Dungeon. While we're talking about plugging things, we edited a book together, procedural generation and game design, which was it's an interesting book. Got lots of little procedural tidbits in it, and we're working on another one on procedural storytelling. That'll have a lot of interesting tidbits in it as well. So all kinds of cool stuff, and you know, hope people enjoy the game. And keep in mind, Dwarf Fortress is free, so you can just download it. Don't have to pay. Always cool when you do.
There's also a Twitter, which is Bay12 Games, I do believe.
Yeah. The Twitter is Bay12 Games. I mostly just tweet releases on there, and if you follow me, because Twitter will push likes, right? I think it's 60% of your likes. It also pushes onto your followers. So you get a lot of cats, a lot of indie dev cats. I like people's indie dev cats when they post them, so it comes through. So that's a either a side benefit or a reason not to follow me on Twitter. Is the kitty cats, and of course there's the forum. If you go to bay12games.com, you'll eventually run into the forum, and you can discuss if you need help playing the game, which is a big thing. You can go to the Dwarf Fortress wiki. Which you'll be able to find. You can go to the Dwarf Fortress forum, and people are very helpful there because they all had the problems too, right? It's not an easy game to get into. Questions, people will help you. We make sure that they're helpful. Everybody is helpful and friendly when you ask questions. So, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
So anything else to add on there?
Everything's fine, right? It's cool and stuff. Yeah, things. No, I don't, in other words.
Well, it was a pleasure actually having on the show, especially considering there seems to be a whole lot on your plate with what you have planned for that game. I probably, now that I think about it, should have maybe picked your brain over tabletop stuff, just because I'm sort of curious what your background is. Oh,
sure. Yeah, no, I mean, are you still recording?
I mean, we are.
Okay, yeah, so
tabletop stuff, let's go.
Yeah, no, you want to do the bonus segment on tabletop stuff?
Let's do a bonus segment on tabletop stuff.
All right, so what do you want to know? Just like what background?
Your background in tabletop, if there's anything you're specifically diving into these days.
Yeah, so now tabletop I'm taking to mean both like pen and paper RPGs and board games or whatever, right?
Yeah. I'm not a fan of Warhammer 40k, but I would consider it tabletop. I'm very much a pen and paper and like Arkham Horror.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So yeah, let's. My.
Your microphone cut out there for a second.
Okay, am I still here?
Oh, you're still here.
Okay, yeah. So my brother and I have Arkham Horror and a bunch of expansions for it. We always play too many expansions and lose. But it's just more fun that way. We always lose. I think we've won it like one time the last 10 times we played it.
If you do, what the heck is it called? The one that has the silver ship. The silver ship makes the game so much easier. Because whenever you close a portal, you can immediately fling yourself into another one across the map.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, super, super good for finishing stuff.
So instead we die.
I mean, death is legit. That's usually... Oh, yeah. Have you actually won it by killing the big guy at the end?
One time, I believe. It's more common for us to get stuck fighting the big guy and losing. Of course, there's the whole one that just destroys the world, and you get to fight him, right?
I think that's
Azathoth or something.
Azathoth, yeah.
Yeah.
His powers is like infinite, and you just die.
Yeah, so we stopped playing him because we never. I think we've won one time, and then the rest of it has been like fighting and losing to the god, but maybe we won that one time too. We don't have a good track record of victory.
Cthulhu's super nasty. for that. I'm a huge nerd, by the way, viewers, and I love Arkham Horror. I also love Betrayal at House on the Hill and Mansions of Madness. So I'm sort of curious if you're familiar with either of those.
I've heard of Mansions of Madness. I haven't played it, and I haven't even heard of it.
Okay, they're both fall in similar things, less time consuming than Arkham Horror, though I was used to playing it with like 4 to 5 people, and when you have more people, it goes on and on.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't had a chance to play recently, or many board games recently. I mean, it's like we tried to play one of those big war games. I don't even remember what, but that was just like a World War II game. But Scamps was the tsunami and took out the entire Pacific Theater. We just decided that we couldn't play a game that lasted more than a day. Which is why Arkham Horror is convenient, because you can kind of get through that in 4 hours or something like that.
Yeah,
and that's enough to like protect the table from the cat without leaving it overnight or anything. And other than that, mostly we just read role-playing game books. Like I have, God, I don't know, it's got to be more than hundreds of them, and read them all. But I don't actually play. I haven't played a role-playing game for 20 years, a pen and paper one. Oh. But we just read, because it's all about systems and ways that people think about systems, right? And systematizing things. And it's probably the last one we read a lot of was very kind of intricate, sort of year 1200 European magic game, like role playing a wizard in Europe and
getting burned as a witch.
Yeah, it has a lot of complex rules about all that kind of thing, about spells and how they work, and how fairies and demons and angels and purely magic things interact with each other in these weird systems. It's kind of informative for Dwarf Fortress procedural magic systems. We'll be thinking about how to integrate things like that, and it's good to see lots of magic systems. Reading all the, but even like the sci-fi ones like Rifts or whatever random sci-fi Shadowrun type stuff, White Wolf stuff is floating around. It all kind of is informative in one way or another for how people systematize things. But it's a very particular and odd habit rather than playing them.
It's fair enough. There's a number of games that I've dived into the systems, been like, this is really interesting, I'd love to play it, and then realized I have no one I could play it with real life.
Yeah, I mean that's part of my problem, is finding time and people. I mean, I don't live in Seattle, and we really don't know anybody but Keppa from Rocket Cat Games out here, and he doesn't do tabletop stuff either. So so there's not a whole lot going on out here. You hear coyotes though, lots of coyotes, and you see raccoons and opossums, and you see a black bear. You can see all manner of critters out here. I
mean, that'd make for some good ambience.
Yeah, no, it's a cool place. You get to see the salmon run up the creeks and stuff. It's a nice place. And still affordable for the time being, although everything's becoming a suburb of Seattle now, and eventually we'll be chased out further into the woods.
Delightful gentrification.
Yeah, I don't know if there's going to be places to go at some point. Something will break at some point if it hasn't already. Feels kind of broken. But yeah, we'll see.
But yeah, I suppose that sums up this interview fairly well. Again, just thanks for providing me the time and popping on the show.
Cool. Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun. I like it when they start getting away from the origin questions and things that we've said before. Of course, you have to set the you have to frame things and set the tone. So of course, it's fine to ask about that stuff, and then we get into more interesting territory. So it's been cool, because it's good to link it to the fans and have new stuff in it. And I'm sure I've definitely said things in this interview I haven't said before. So very good, very good.
And also need to link it for the people who haven't had the huge familiarity towards Dwarf Fortress.
Yeah. I mean, it's like there's you have to start somewhere. Some Dwarf Fortress. Everybody learns things all the time.
On that note, to the viewers, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment, and, subscribe if you'd like to. There's a little bell icon you can click to get notifications. Again, if you do comment, I do my utmost to respond to all of you folks. And if you have any suggestions for games you'd like to see covered in any of our content, feel free to leave a message in that regard. In the meantime, I'll catch you folks next time, and as ever, it's been a pleasure.